Hello, it's so nice to see you here today. This month we're going to be working on the surface of the water, and for this first project we're going to look at birds. So birds starts out with basically a teardrop shape for the body, and then it has a neck and a head. And depending on what kind of bird it is, it might be sitting on the surface of the water like a goose. And to tell you the truth, I was actually going to do a Canada goose until the idea to do a pink flamingo popped into my head. You could also do a fluffy white swan, similar, slightly different head and neck shape, and really fluffy wings. Or you could do a duck, and it's slightly smaller than a goose or a swan. Now, all of those birds basically sit on the surface of the water with their body floating on the surface. Now, you probably know that I'm going to be doing a pink flamingo, but you don't have to do one if you don't want to. They're all essentially the same. Pink flamingo has a very long and curved neck and looks a little snake-like at the moment, but the difference between a flamingo is that it has these long legs. And I know it looks a little snake-like at the moment, but I can always make alterations to my drawing here. And keep in mind, you can also alter your stitching the same way. So I mentioned this last month that on my scroll here, I've got this section here where I have created basically a skyline there, and there's water below with the sky above. So that's something that you might want to do if you haven't already done that. This is a piece of cloth that I'm going to cut out for my bird body. So I'm going to cut out a teardrop-like shape, and I'm just winging it. If you want to draw lines, please go ahead. But as I mentioned, you can make adjustments. So I'm trying this out, and I'm thinking it's a wee bit too big. It's a little bit big, so I can cut it down. So that's one thing, that you can't make it bigger, but you can certainly make it smaller. Well, I shouldn't say that. You can actually make it bigger with your stitches. You could stitch around the outside edge. So I like this size now. I think this is going to fit. It's going to be a good proportion, and I'm going to be able to add my head and neck without it going off my little teeny tiny bit of cloth. So I've been thinking about what stitches I want to use, and I thought that really long, narrow fly stitches will look like feathers. Now, normally a fly stitch is a short stitch, but I'm going to do really long, narrow ones to mimic feathers, and I'm certainly not going for realism, and I'm going to overlap them. So all of the feathers are going to be generally pointing from the rounded part of my teardrop shape towards the tail. So the open end is going to be at the top there, and the securing stitch is going to be towards the tail. Now, they're not going to be perfectly lined up. They'll be slightly angled one way or the other, and it doesn't matter. They can also go over the edge of this little piece of cloth here, and that will secure the edge down. Now, I'm using pink thread and 2 or 3 strands. You'll probably also notice that I'm using a thimble because my finger was a little bit sore. I've been doing a lot of stitching lately, and I think I must have been sewing on thick fabric because the tip of my fingers, or maybe I haven't been sewing a lot lately, and my finger is out of practice. But I thought I would wear a thimble, but I end up having a little bit of difficulty with it because I'm not used to wearing a thimble. So I am using my stitches, my feather-like stitches, to secure down that piece of cloth, but also to modify the color. So I'm using pink thread, which will modify the color of my flamingo wing there, but I really like the way that the patterned cloth adds an extra layer of complexity. There you go. I've given up on the thimble. I've decided to live with the pain. I can just sew in one color thread, but there's a lot of variation that without me having to do much work. But you can certainly use whatever you have on hand. Although I haven't finished sewing all the way around the edge, I'm going to add the head and the neck now. And I'm going to use chain stitch because I like the way that chain stitch creates a smooth curved line. So I'm just putting down the basic shape, and I can always modify it and alter it and make it thicker with more rows of stitching side by side. But to to start with, what I want to do is sort of get the basic positioning off my head and neck, and then I'll work more on it later. So for my flamingo, it has quite a long neck and it has quite a curve to it. Now again, I'm doing this freehand without any construction lines on my piece, but certainly if it's easier for you to follow along, feel free to draw a pencil line in there that you can follow for the shape. I've been sewing for a very long time, and my stitches quite often do what I want them to, but if that's a struggle for you and you're just learning to do the stitches, then maybe the learning piece for you is how to do the stitches. For me, it's more fun and more interesting for me to see where the stitches land. But you'll see this month that things don't always go as planned. So there's my first line, and I think that looks pretty good, but I want it to be thicker. So the head I know is going to be bigger or wider, bulkier than the neck part. So I'm going to start adding more stitches, another row of chain stitch heading back down along the line of the neck, and I want it to be solidly filled in. Now, the reason that I'm not using cloth in this part is that it would be a really narrow piece of cloth. I don't think it would be really adding any benefit, and the few rows of stitching that I have to add in here don't really need a supporting cloth underneath them. So, but if you had some pink ribbon or ribbon that was a good color for your bird's neck, then absolutely use that. Now, initially when I was thinking about doing birds like this, I thought I was going to do a Canada goose because that seemed to make sense. I live in Canada, and I thought I would make a Canada goose, but then somewhere along the line I decided on a flamingo. I think that there will be in future months a goose of some sort. But if you have a particular aquatic bird that speaks to you, then absolutely choose something other than a flamingo. But it is fun. I mean I like the idea of it being bright pink. After I go around the neck, I've got a bit of thread left, so I'm going to go take that opportunity to now go around and secure more of the cloth that makes up the body. It does two things. It secures the cloth down. It also moves the thread down to where I want to create the legs. Now, I don't want the legs to be as wide as the head and neck. I want them to be narrower. So I'm not going to use chain stitch here. I'm going to use stem stitch, which creates a nice line too, a solid line, but it's not as bulky as the chain stitch. Now, I could have also, if I wanted to do chain stitch, I could have switched to fewer strands of thread, and then that would create a thinner line as well. And one of my legs is straight and one of them is bent in that characteristic positioning off a flamingo's legs. And there, I think that looks pretty good now. So now I've got some more, I've rethreaded my needle there. So I'm going to go back up to the top and continuing to thicken up that head and neck area there with more chain stitches. And if I want some areas to be narrower, like along the neck, I'll switch over to a stem stitch there, which will thicken it up a little bit, but not as much as if I were using chain stitch. So, and I'm just going to keep working on this for as long as it takes until I like the way it looks. Now, one thing to keep in mind as you're doing stitching, and I rarely ever cut my stitches out, but the thing to keep in mind is you can always make things thicker, you can't make them thinner. So I'm usually giving some thought to whether I want things to get thicker or not. And before I add, I really think about how thick do I want that line to be, because I don't want to have to take out the stitches if it becomes too thick. Or if it does become too thick, I might have to bulk up some other area. And now what I'm thinking here is that and at this point I thought, well, I think that that body is a little bit too big, so I trimmed off a little bit, which I can do because I don't have any template to follow. So if I decide that I want to do that, then that's all I can do whatever I like. The other thing that I decided to do is I wanted my flamingo to be kind of fluffy looking, so I took some of my stitches over the edge of the cloth and into the background area, so that not a lot, just a little bit, just extended them a little bit. But what that ended up doing was it made the body of my bird bigger than it was. And I was already thinking it was a little bit too big. So I think in hindsight, in reflection, next time I were to do this, I might make the body a fair bit smaller than I think it should be, so that would give me room to play around the edges and make them fluffy. Now, if I wanted a really smooth textured bird, that would be less of a problem. And now I'm going in and I'm thinking that those legs, they were looking a little spindly. So what I'm doing is I'm whipping the stitches. What I'm doing is I'm just wrapping my thread around the stitches. I'm not going into the cloth. I'm just going around and around the stitches, just like a candy cane or a barber pole or something like that. I'm wrapping it around, and that tends to make them a little bit more bulky and also smoother. And now those legs are in the water. So what I thought I would do is create some little ripples. So basically an oval shape, not a circular shape, an oval shape that's squished on the top and the bottom and wider out to the side. So starting to one side off the legs and then going around in a wide oval towards the other side off the legs. I'm using back stitch, but I'm not worrying too much about it being a solid back stitch. I'm leaving some gaps between the stitches because really, and just with one strand of thread, I don't want these ripples to be really bold and thick. I just want them to have the merest suggestion that they're there, because they are certainly, the ripples in the water are not as bold as the bird. I want the bird to be the emphasis, but I want the ripples to be there. Something you could leave out, and I'm doing several rows of ripples. The first one was the smallest, and now I'm going around making a slightly bigger oval around the first ripple that I did. And again, they go in behind the legs and then come around towards the bottom of the legs, if that makes sense. And I will tell you now that I had a lot of challenges this month. I'm not sure what the heck was going on. It's been really hot in my house, and my camera didn't record things. I was feeling really flustered as I was sewing. It's really hot. I don't have air conditioning in my house, and we're in, for Vancouver, what's called a heat wave. So I can only actually film at certain times of the day, early in the morning before the sun starts to hit my house. And even then, it's really muggy and warm in my house. And I don't know if that was affecting my mood or my ability to do things, but my goodness, was this month difficult for me to do this. But I do like the way that some bits turned out, and there are some parts that are not great, and I've considered not including them, but I think that it's important to see that things don't always go as planned, and maybe in a month or so I'll like the way some of these pieces look more than I do right now. So there is my flamingo, almost finished. One last thing that I want to add is flamingos tend to have black beaks. So now I'm going back up to the top with black thread and two or three strands of black thread to create that beak, just with straight stitches. A few straight stitches, and I almost feel like, looking at this, I could probably have stopped right there, but I kept going and adding more stitches until I felt like the beak was done. And I'm not sure if that many stitches were necessary, but yeah, again, keep in mind that you can always add more. You can't take things, well, you can take things away. It's just a little fiddly. But I can keep on adding as much as I like. If I felt like I wanted to refine the neck and head, I could absolutely do more of that after I finish with the beak here. And I'm also going to use that black thread to create a little French knot eye there. And, you know, is it an anatomically correct flamingo? Probably not. Is it recognizable as a flamingo? I think so. Anyway, I like it. Happy stitching, and I will see you again soon. Bye for now.